What's up guys, I'm Puneet from Programiz and welcome back to this series on JavaScript. In our last videos, we have learned about the working of a JavaScript array. Now we'll learn about the map, filter and reduce methods that are very useful while performing various operations on an array. So let's get started. Before we learn about these methods, let's do a quick brush up on arrays. In JavaScript, we use an array to store multiple values together. For example, I'll go on my code editor and let me create an array called numbers that will store the numbers from 1 to 5. So it's basically just a collection of numbers stored together in one variable. Now suppose we want to find the square number of each of these elements, then we need to loop over the elements and perform the squaring functionality. This means to perform any operation on an array, we need to first access each element of the array one by one. Now to easily access each element of the array and perform a certain action, we can use map, filter and reduce. Let's start with the easiest, the map method. To understand the map method, let's see an example first. I have an array from before. Now I want to find the square of each element of this array. I can use the map method like this. Now I want to find the square of each element of this array. Before I use the map method, let me first write the equivalent for loop that will do this for me. So I would start with a result array, or let's call this squared. So I'll say squared. I would have to start with an empty array, then for let I equals 0, I less than numbers dot length. So I want to go to the end of the array and I want to add one number to the index. Then I would say squared dot push numbers times numbers, and let me just verify that this indeed works. So I'll say console log squared. So what I'm doing is I'm looping through all the elements in the array, and I actually wanted to do not the array multiplication, but so inside the for loop I am taking each element of the array one by one. So I will be 0 in the first iteration, so I want to multiply numbers 0, which is 1, with numbers 0 again, and squared array will now contain 1 times 1, which is 1. In the second iteration I will be 1, so I less than numbers that length is 5, so this is true, so the loop will continue, and squared dot push, so this will become 2 and this will become 2. This goes on, so I will be 3 and this becomes 3.3. So squared should have an array of all the squared numbers in this array. I'll press run just to verify, and you can see that I got the array of squared numbers. Now let me simplify this code by using the map method. I can, instead of doing this, what I can also do is I can say const result equals numbers dot map, and inside this map I can send a function that will take each number one by one and just return number times number. Let me console log result just to show you that this works like before. I'll press run. So you can see that I got the same result as before. Now let's see what's happening here. The map method takes each element from the numbers array. So 1 will be transferred to 1 here, and imagine this as 1 times 1. So whatever value is returned from the function is pushed into the result array. So think of this as, so 1 by 1 will do this. So numbers 0 is 1, 1 is passed to this function, and the return value 1 times 1 becomes result dot push 1 times 1. Similarly, in the next iteration we take 2 and put it inside here. So the return value is 2 times 2, and think of this as result dot push 2 times 2. In the third iteration this becomes result dot push 3 times 3. In the fourth iteration result dot push 4 times 4, and in the fifth iteration this becomes result dot push 5 times 5. So whatever transformation function you define inside will be used on every element of the numbers array one by one. So we will always get an array of the same size as the initial array because we are applying the transformation function on each number or each element. In this case, this is a number. I hope this was clear. This will be more clear in the future videos or as we practice JavaScript even more. Now don't get confused. So right now we wrote this, or we can even give this function a name. So square number, and then we wrote return number times number. Now you can see variations of this everywhere. So first of all, let me first turn this into an arrow function. So you will see this variation in many places as well. Always remember that this is just an arrow function and a different representation of a function and nothing more. In fact, you'll also see another representation a lot. Since there is only one line in my function, I don't need the parenthesis and I can just say number arrow number times number. You will see another variation where even these braces are removed or these parentheses are removed, and this works because the function or an arrow function can work without the parenthesis around the parameters when there is only one parameter. So you will see all of these variations, and I recommend that you spend more time understanding arrow functions before you dig deep into map or filter or all of these methods. Alright, now that's out of the way, let's do another example to drive home the point. Remember that this is one of the most complex parts of JavaScript, so spend time. I'll take this one step at a time. Alright, I'll remove this old code and let me say I have an array of names, James, Marie and Rosa, right? An array with 3 elements. Suppose all these people belong to the same family and all of them have the same surname. Now if I want to provide surname to all of them, I can simply use the map method. I can say const full names equals names.map. Now remember that map takes a function that takes each element of this array one by one. So for each name, I want to return name plus their surname. Let's call it Smith with a space in between. So this is the concatenation operator, and you must have guessed the output by now. If I say console log full names and press run, I will get an array with Smith added to each element. Again, just like before, don't get confused if you see an arrow function like this or an arrow function, since this function has only one line, an arrow function like this or an arrow function like this. These all mean the same thing and they will all work. As you can see, I've successfully added surnames to all of these names using the map method very simply without writing a lot of code. If you're enjoying this video, please also check out Programiz Pro, where we provide tutorials along with quizzes and challenges which will help you practice and test your learning in real time. Also, the course includes projects to give you an awesome experience of how programming works in the real world. And for our YouTube subscribers, we are giving 50% off on the yearly plan. Sign up by scanning this QR code or use the link in the video description to claim your discount. Let's move on to the filter method. The filter method is used to filter out the array elements based on a particular condition. Let me give you an example. Suppose I'll go back to my old numbers array. So numbers equals 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Let me just add spaces here. Doesn't make a difference but just looks nicer. Now if we only want those elements from the array that are less than 3, we can use the filter method, but before that let me do this using the for loop. So if I was going to do this with the for loop, I would do let result. I'd start with an empty array and then I would say for let I equals 0, I less than numbers dot length and I plus plus, and inside I would say if. So I would say const number equals numbers I, and I would say if number less than 3, only then I want you to add the number to the result array. Now outside if I say console log result and press run, you can see that I was successfully able to add only those numbers to the result array which satisfy my function or my condition number less than 3. Now let's try to do the same thing using the filter function. If you have understood the map function, the filter function should seem really easy for you. So I can just say const less than 3 equals numbers dot filter, and now let me add a function here. Just like map, function takes each number as the parameter. Inside this function, I'll just say if number less than 3, return true, and then else return false. So compare this to this and you will be able to see that one by one the numbers will be sent to this function. So let's do this. All right, I'll remove this. Because these are complex concepts, I want to spend as much time simulating the output as I can. All right, so I'll just take 1 and put it here. Now is 1 less than 3? Yes, return true. That means 1 gets to enter the less than 3 club. So let's say 1 gets to enter. All right, now let's move on to the next element. 2 is 2 less than 3? Yes, because this function returns true, 2 gets to enter this club of less than 3. Now let's go to 3. So we'll go to 3. Is 3 less than 3? No. This function returns false, so 3 does not get to enter this club of less than 3 array. That means this filter function removes all the elements that don't satisfy my condition. Now I can write this more concisely by saying just in one line, number arrow number less than 3. Why does this work? Because this is a Boolean expression that will return true and false based on whether number is less than 3 or not, and this is an arrow function that returns this Boolean expression. So a filter function, as long as it returns true or false, and that gives me whether I should send that number to this result array or not, as long as it returns that true or false state, then it works. So let me just make sure that this works. Console log less than 3, and I'll press run. And as you can see, by writing a very small function, a very small function, I can get the same result as a long for loop. Let's see one more example so that this is very clear to you. Let me change the function so that I filter out the odd elements. Now we already have this template here, but still I'll remove this. Let me start. So I'll even name the function, so I can even give the function a name, and I know that this function will receive each element of this array. So I'll call the element number, and I can just say return number modulo t2 equals 0, because I wanted to filter out the odd numbers. That means I want only the even numbers, which this condition gives me. So let's again do the same exercise as before. I will put 1 here, return 1%2 equals 0. This is false, so less than 3, or let's call it even numbers. So even numbers will not have 1. We go to 2, put 2 here, 2 modulus 2, or the remainder when 2 is divided by 2 is in fact 0, so 2 gets to go in. Let's go with 3. 3 modulo 2 is not 0, so this result is false and 3 does not get to go in, and 4 is allowed to go, 5 is not allowed to go. So once you start visualizing the filter function in this way, you will be able to understand it and be writing filter functions in no time. I'll again reduce this to a very small manageable function, arrow function. So I'll call it number and number modulo 2 equals 0. This should also do the same thing as before. So let me just check even numbers, and when I press run, you can see that I got an array of 2 and 4 which filter out all the odd numbers. Okay guys, we need your support to keep these kinds of content free for all users. YouTube really likes engagement on the video, so leave a comment below, press that like button and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Let's get the engagement score high up so that more people can discover and enjoy these courses. The reduce method is the most advanced of the 3 array methods that I'm going to talk about in this video. We learned about the map and filter functions. The reduce method is used to execute a certain function on each element of an array, just like map and filter, but it works a bit differently. I'll show you with an example. So I'll start with an array like this. So numbers equals 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now what if I wanted to find the sum of all these elements? Let me write a for loop as usual. So I'll say sum of numbers equals 0 and then for let I equals 0, I less than numbers dot length I plus plus, and what I would do is I would say sum of numbers equals sum of numbers plus numbers I. If you're having trouble understanding this for loop, I suggest that you go back to our video on for loops and make sure that you understand this first, because you will not understand reduce if you're not clear about this one. Alright, so let me just confirm console log sum of numbers and press run, and you get 15, which is the sum of these numbers. Now let's think about how this program works. We start with a number called 0, so this is sort of the base value, and when I is 0, so sum of numbers is 0, and again sum of numbers is 0, and numbers I is 1. So my sort of, I can say sum of numbers is 0 plus 1. That means the sum of numbers variable now contains 1. Now in the second loop I go to 2, so numbers I becomes 2, and sum of numbers, because it was initially 1, now sum of number becomes 1 plus 2, which is 3. Now you can see that sum of numbers is really like an accumulator that is accumulating the sum till now in each iteration of the for loop. This concept is important when we try to use the reduce function. So the reduce function is very similar, but what we'll do is we'll say sum of numbers equals numbers dot reduce. Instead of, so I know till now that I need to pass a function. So let me just put an empty function here. Just like map and filter, I cannot just put number here. Instead, the reduce function takes 2 parameters, an accumulator and the current value. So inside this function, I need to pass the new value of the accumulator. First, before I do that, remember the for loop that I wrote before. So let me first copy this code, go back and make sure that I have this loop somewhere. Alright, I'll go down here, and now let me call this sum of numbers 1. So remember our accumulator, which is sum of numbers, the initial value was 0. So to the second parameter of the reduce function, we pass the initial value of the accumulator. Now this function should return the new value of the accumulator on each iteration. That means, just like before, what was the new value of the accumulator after each iteration? It was the old value of the accumulator plus the current value, or the current value of the numbers array which I was iterating through at that iteration. So I can just say return accumulator plus current value, and this will give me the sum of the numbers. Let's just check. So console.log sum of numbers 1. This will be clearer as we go through more examples, and I'll press run. You can see that I got 15. Now let's try to see what happened here. During the first iteration, the accumulator is the value 0, because this is the default value that I've given. So the accumulator is 0, and the current value will be the first value, which is 1. So this will return 0 plus 1, which is 1. Now for the next iteration, this return value will be passed to the accumulator variable. So this will be 1, and the current value which is 2, will be passed to the current value. Now what will this function return? It will return the value 1, which is the current value of the accumulator, plus the current value of the iteration or the numbers array which I'm iterating through. Alright, now the accumulator becomes 1 plus 2, so this becomes 3, and we move to the next element, which is 3. This becomes the current value. Now I return 3 plus 3, which becomes the new value of the accumulator, so this becomes 6, and the new value is 4, so the current value becomes 4. And what do I return? I return 6 plus 4, which is 10. Now the accumulator is 10 and the current value becomes 5, and finally I return 10 plus 5, which is 15, and that is what I get in sum of numbers 1. Now this was a bit complex, but I will do 1 or 2 more examples so that you can understand what reduce really means. Let's go back to a map and filter function and do things with reduce that we did with map and filter. So I will find the squares of all the numbers. Let's do the for loop that will do that. So I'll say squares equals this, and then let me uncomment this, and we would do squares dot push numbers I times numbers I, and I can console log the squares. I'll do this, and I hope this works. Alright, you can see that by using a for loop I was able to calculate all the squares of each number and put them in a squares array. Now I can do this using a map function as we have learned, but let me try to use reduce instead, because this is more challenging and more fun. So everything you can do with a map you can also do with a reduce. Alright, now I'll remove this old code and I'll say const squares 1 equals numbers dot reduce. As before, remember that it needs an accumulator and a current value, and the second parameter will be the default value of the accumulator, which is an empty array in this case. So let me put the empty array here. Now what should be the accumulated value at the end of each iteration? It should be the original, or I should say accumulator dot push. I need to add a new element to the accumulator each time. What do I need to push? Obviously the current value squared, so current value times current value, and don't forget I need to return the accumulator each time. So what's going to happen here is the accumulator will be, in the first iteration it will be an empty array, and the current value will be 1. So accumulator dot push current value 1 times 1, and the new accumulator becomes 1, an array containing just 1. Now the current value becomes 2, so accumulator dot push 2 times 2, and because I'm returning this new array, so this was an array containing just 1 dot push 2 times 2, so this becomes 1 comma 4. The current value now becomes 3, so this becomes 3, and this becomes 1 comma 4 dot push 3 times 3, and so on. And finally the accumulator will contain, or the squares one will contain, all the squares of the elements. Let's use reduce to simulate a filter function now. Remember that I only included the elements which were less than 3. Let's do that here as well. So less than 3 equals an empty array, and I would typically do if numbers I, or the current element, less than 3, then less than 3 dot push numbers I. So this would give me all the elements that are less than 3. It works like this. Now always think about the accumulator as the initial value that you take. So the initial value is okay. Now what do I need to change inside here? This will be accumulator, and this will be current value. Now I want to add to the accumulator only if the current value is less than 3. So if current value is less than 3, then accumulator dot push current value, and there's an explicit else that don't do anything if the value is greater than 3, and at the end don't forget to return the accumulator. So return accumulator, and let me remove this for conciseness, and this should give me the list of numbers that are less than 3. Let me call it less than 3. Alright, I'll remove this old code and let's simulate what happened here. So numbers.reduce function, the accumulator was initially this empty array, so I'll put an empty array here, and the current value was 1. The 1 is 1 less than 3. Yes, the accumulator gets pushed the current value, so empty array dot push 1. Now my accumulator becomes an array with element 1. Now I go to the next element, which is 2. So is 2 less than 3? Yes. So 1 dot push 2, and now my accumulator becomes 1 comma 2. Now for the next element, 3, is 3 less than 3? No, false. So I just return the existing accumulator, which is 1 comma 2, and that's why no other elements get added in the next iterations. Map, filter and reduce are a bit complicated for beginners, but once you start using them, you will never go back to for loops. That's my experience with map, filter and reduce. I really love writing these functions. Now to practice what we learned, here's a programming task for you. Create an array named greet with values hello, hi and welcome. Use the map method to add a new string word to each element of the array. Remember, 2 words should be separated by a space. From this new array, filter out the element that have more than 8 characters. You'll find the answer to this question in our GitHub repository. Also, if you want to revise these concepts, you can find all these programs there as well. I'll put the link in the video description below. Now that we've reached the end of this video, it's time for the Programiz quiz. What is the output of this program? You can see the options on the screen. Comment your answer below, and happy programming!